Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're looking forward to a day of conversations about a set of issues that are enormously important and only increasing so over time. And that, in saying that, I mean issues around sustainability. And when I say sustainability, we take a broad view of this. That is, I'm not just talking about the environmental health of the planet. I'm talking about leaving our communities, society writ large, in a better state than what we found it in. Now, social enterprise, social entrepreneurs take this as one of our central goals. And the objective today is to have some discussions about how to do this job better. There are a lot of new ideas percolating out in the world, and we've brought a lot of them into this room. New ideas, innovations in capital markets, new technologies, new ideas in management. So many, many ideas that we can take to doing this job that much better. Now, in the spirit of the event, I've actually brought my notes on a little tablet, which is shut down. So, and I can get only so far as the long list of people I have to thank. I don't want to leave anyone out before turning it back on. First of all, I'd like to thank Seema Balani and Amrita Subramanian, the two conference co-chairs who are kind of the glue that stick this whole thing together, along with the social enterprise staff. I would also, and I know we need to stay on time, but let me ask a quick question. Where is the greatest concentration of social impact investment dollars in the world? Which country? It is not the US, it is not India. It is China. So in that spirit, and emphasizing the importance of doing this job well in China for a great many reasons, I'd like to thank our premium sponsor, the Shenzhen Innovation Corporate Social Responsibility Development Center, who's joining us here today. I'd like to thank our leadership sponsors, HP and Wells Fargo, our executive sponsors, Anheuser-Busch, Hendrick and Struggles, Mitchell Golden, Bob Williams, Morgan Stanley, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, because without their help, we wouldn't be here having these conversations this morning. As a final note, before I turn things over to Alicia and Lynne, this really is the flagship event for the Social Enterprise Program at Columbia Business School. Our objective, our mission, is to help the next generation of leaders solve social and environmental problems. And this sort of interchange and exchange of ideas is really one of the main ways that we do it. And I see no better way to start things off than by turning things over to two longtime friends of the Social Enterprise Program, Professor Lynne Sagalyn and Deputy Mayor Alicia Glen.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks, Ray. It's really a pleasure to be here. Social enterprise does hold a special place in my intellectual hat that I generally wear, and my heart as well. So does Deputy Mayor Alicia Glen. It's really very much fun for me to be doing this with her. We've known each other a very long time. And in terms of somebody coming into the administration and bringing new ideas and a level of energy that would be very hard to beat, the city is really very fortunate to have her in the position that she's in. We're going to proceed with a kind of a series of questions for about a half an hour or so, and then there'll be Q&A from the audience. So let me start off with the obvious question, which is, you've been called Mayor de Blasio's chief liaison to the private sector, coming from Goldman Sachs, where you were head of the Urban Investment Group for some 12 years. How do you balance the competing interests between the mayor's agenda and the business community? Where are the points of intersection? Where are some of the tension points? And how do they get resolved?
That's a really long, complex, and compound question. I would expect nothing less. First of all, it's great to be here because I was lucky enough to be an adjunct at Columbia Business School, and it's my neighborhood, it's my home. So it's great to be here today and see some of my former students here as well. I mean, I think even the way you phrase the question may be the wrong way to think about it. I think that it's not so much where are the points of conflict between us and the private sector, but really where are the ways in which our agenda and the private sectors are absolutely aligned. And I would say there are a couple of fairly obvious places where we're working very closely with the private sector. I think the first is that everybody recognizes that for New York's economy to stay strong and to grow, we need to deal with a fundamental problem we have with our housing markets. Our lack of housing is, again, well beyond what people have historically thought of as an affordable housing crisis for low-income people. It is really, in our view, fundamentally going to impact our ability to grow as an economy. And so the business community and the institutional community also recognize for the first time, I think in a very, very real way, that being partners with us in our Housing New York agenda is absolutely critical. Again, not just the classic issues around equity and sort of your social responsibility to house low-income people, but at the end of the day, New York City will not be able to attract and retain the kind of talent that we need to grow in the long run without having a very healthy housing market. And so we've made a very, very strong commitment, for those of you who follow this stuff, to really take housing production to the next level. Obviously very focused on affordable housing, both new production of affordable housing, also preserving affordable housing, but an absolute commitment to identifying where in the city we can have significant increases in residential production, period, so that we can accommodate our growing workforce and deal with some of our existing challenges. So I think housing, for the first time, I think we have a tighter relationship with some of the stakeholders in the real estate market than we've ever had. I think, again, another place that there's incredible overlap is also where are we going to be growing our city to accommodate the new innovation economy and really the changing nature of who will be fundamentally this much more diversified economy. So not only are we trying to work with our traditional engines of economic growth, the financial services sector, et cetera. Obviously, there's been a lot of news lately about JP Morgan Chase and other things. You know, there is an ongoing dialogue about what the real estate needs are of the traditional economy, but more importantly is where are we thinking about where the broader tech ecosystem is going to be. And what is a placemaking around that, and how can the city align with the real estate sector from a zoning and investment point of view to really create the kind of space that those companies want to be in and where their workforce want to be?
Yeah, that's the question I have, is that one of the aspects that's so interesting about the New York City economy is that New York has a way of reinventing itself whenever it needs to reinvent itself, and I think it's in that period of reinvention now. So what do you think has to be done to accommodate more of the tech sector and the new job creation and the millennials that are part of that drive to that reason why we need more housing and we need other things here?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a couple of things happening simultaneously. One, again, our office sector has been very much, as you know, located either in the Midtown sort of central business district. Then, obviously, the efforts with regard to Lower Manhattan, which originally we thought would be, as you know, you're writing about this, government offices and big financials. We're actually seeing huge amounts of media, communications, new tech starting to go down to Lower Manhattan. Hudson Yards also will have a more non-traditional or diversified tenant base. But at the end of the day, and I'm sure you guys would all agree with this, cooler, funkier startup companies, they don't want to be in a big office tower. That's not who they are. That's not who their corporate branding is. That's not what their workforce need to be. And so, as you know, we have like 99% occupancy in all of the Brooklyn Tech Triangle, Dumbo. Long Island City is pretty much bursting as well. And so we are very consciously working to identify other assets that can be repositioned into funky sort of Class B, Class C office space, which is where these companies want to be anyway. It's part of their identity. And or thinking about new models of development that can incorporate, again, a different form of office space that's much more of a mixed-use, place-based approach, which is where really, you know, the millennials want to work, or they want to bike ride, you know, and they want to have a whole different experience. And the way even the floor plates are laid out, as you know, are very different than traditional sector. So, you know, we're making huge infrastructure investments in downtown Brooklyn, on the Brooklyn waterfront, on Long Island City, on what we're now calling No Show, which is the North Shore of Staten Island. I'm telling you right now, it's going to be hot. It's amazing what's going on out there. Buy property in Staten Island. I'm not kidding you. And really thinking about this as a 5-borough exercise, not just because it's the right economic development policy to really think about New York as the 5 boroughs in a much more equitable way, but at the end of the day, the stock there is more interesting for folks in their 20s and 30s. And then it allows us to simultaneously work with, again, what I would call the traditional engines of the New York economy. I mean, we have to get more diverse, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think the fact that these companies like Etsy and Kickstarter and all these guys want to be in what were secondary markets actually is a great blessing, because we can be working with both sides of the equation at the same time.
San Francisco's had a problem with rapid housing price increases and gentrification because of the rapid growth of tech industry. To what extent do you think that this New York City's 5 boroughs, in a sense, is 4 other safety valves from this for this to avoid that happening? Or what are the concerns that your office thinks about to possibly mediate some of the pressures from rapid growth and the impact on housing markets?
Right. Well, I mean, San Francisco, everybody likes to talk about San Francisco and New York. I mean, no offense to San Francisco, it's like not even in the same league. I mean, it's like 500,000 people live in San Francisco. We have 8.5 million people today. That's not even with the undercount. We're going to be 9 million people by 2030. And so I think there is this, it's very much sort of in the ether, right, that San Francisco and New York are comparable. San Francisco is an amazing place. I love San Francisco. I've done a lot of work in San Francisco. But they have so many different kinds of constraints to growth. And the general municipal approach has been much less pro-growth, period. That they, in some ways, have created their own problem. And having then, obviously, Oakland and Berkeley and the whole East Bay become an alternative and really the only opportunity for housing development. We have a completely different view of the world, which is we have 5 boroughs, all of which really are part of New York City, both literally and figuratively.
And well-connected.
And well-connected and getting more well-connected. I mean, it's certainly not right to say that we have it down pat and it's perfect, because a lot of our transportation infrastructure really reflects what an early 20th century footprint of growth was, particularly when you look at our rolling stock. But we are consciously saying, from a planning and strategic investment point of view, where are we going to accommodate this really interesting boom of mixed-use projects? And so where do we begin to overlay other transportation systems that can then connect boroughs to each other? Not everything is hub and spoke anymore. And thinking about whether it's really expanding our ferry service, thinking about other ways in which we just announced yesterday or 2 days ago, the expansion of City Bike is huge. I mean, that really is fundamentally an example of how a supplemental transportation system will reflect growth patterns, both residentially and commercially. So I think San Francisco is an amazing place, but in some respects, they've created their own problem by not being pro-development. Well, we are pro-development.
Yeah, and they're a very much more regulated city.
It is even harder to get a deal done there than it is here, which gives me makes me feel a little bit better when I hear people complaining about how hard it is to do business in New York. I would say, go hang out in San Francisco. So, I think the de Blasio administration has been very clear, whether it's in our land use policies in terms of streamlining how quick you can now get into the process. Something that the city planning chair, Carl Weisbrot, has actually cut down the time it takes to get into the entitlement process. We also have a clock, whether you like it or not. If you're seeking planning approvals in New York, it's a 7-month clock. You're either in or you're out. In California, you can go on for years.
Well, you also have as-of-right zoning.
Yeah.
Most cities do not have as-of-right zoning, which, I mean, this city would be locked up and frozen without as-of-right zoning.
Absolutely.
Let me go back to the housing issues for a minute, because I think there's so much that you can talk about. I'd like to have you talk about what are the ways the city prioritizes the recipients of public housing, because however much we produce, it's still a scarce commodity.
Well, I think one thing also, and again, because this is not purely a New York audience, is you have to understand there are several different housing markets, right, that are operating contemporaneously. So we do have public housing, which is housing that is owned and operated by the Housing Authority. And that's 650,000 units. So again, it's bigger than San Francisco. Okay, so just to give you a sense of, that's our public housing stock, which again is a city unto itself. And that has, over the years, for a variety of reasons, become more the housing for our lowest income New Yorkers. Again, because it is the lowest rents and it is federally subsidized but controlled by the city. And then we have what we talk about now as affordable housing is really the private sector providing affordable housing or housing that's restricted to different incomes in return for a variety of different incentives or financing. And we do that through literally financing programs, right, where the city spends close to $1 billion a year actually financing and subsidizing the production of affordable housing with either for-profit or nonprofit developers. We, as you may have read or may know, is we are in the process of instituting a mandatory inclusionary housing program, which will, for the first time ever, instead of it being optional for you to put affordable housing in or near your project in return for a bonus or some kind of incentive, if you want to build a residential building in areas where we are rezoning, you will have to provide affordable housing. And again, that's owned and operated then by the developer.
Right.
So my point is that there's all these different markets working simultaneously. You have actually public housing that's owned. It's really generally for the lowest income families. And then the place that I think is most interesting and what I think our housing plan has really become a model for the globe, and I just came back from London where we talked a lot about this, is because it's municipally financed or incentivized, we can address a much wider array of housing issues, which goes back to the workforce point, which is New York City has such an affordability crisis. It is so expensive to live in New York that as a public policy matter, we can make a decision that we want to assist people who are more middle or moderate income because they're fundamental to our workforce strategy. And so I think if you look at the plan, it's very, very innovative with respect to the range of folks we want to serve.
And
right?
you have to serve the range.
And you have to, because the federal government is focusing on a very narrow band of what they consider to be the affordable housing crisis. And so the city can use all of its tools to play on those other ends. And those ends are incredibly important, whether it's 50,000 people who are living in shelter, which is absolutely unacceptable for the wealthiest city in America, or it's the hundreds of thousands of folks who have to spend more than half of their disposable income to rent an apartment, which will fundamentally undermine the long-term viability of our economy.
And, you know, for those of you in the audience who may be new to the housing issue, New York City has an incredibly deep history of providing all kinds of innovative housing solutions way before the federal government got into this business in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, there's just an enormous amount of history of creative approaches to housing. So it's wonderful to see the de Blasio administration carrying on not only a needed goal, but a historic tradition of doing it on our own here. The administration also has made a very clear and position on its goal of addressing inequality. And it's been, you know, clearly that's obvious in being aggressively addressing the affordability housing issue. What else is the administration thinking about in terms of investing in projects or initiatives that will address inequality across the five boroughs?
I mean, look, this is obviously the question of the century, and we may only be 14 years into the century, but I think, you know, it's a great and crazy day when my former boss, Lloyd Blankfein, and Mayor Bill de Blasio, a well-known progressive, say the exact same thing, which is that fundamentally the extent of inequality is really undermining and a danger to the long-term growth of the United States. And I think that what we're seeing is that this extraordinary barbell distribution of income is becoming now fairly clear to economists from all, you know, flavors of the political spectrum as the critical issue which will ultimately retard growth domestically. And so, you know, we live obviously within a very complex set of dynamics, many of which are not controlled by the city of New York, right? I mean, there's enormous issues with the capital markets and global markets. But
inequality is
it's a global issue, obviously, and it's the global issue of our time. But I think for the first time, it's really resonating as a very clearly domestic issue, and then becomes more and more of an urban issue as, you know, 50, 60, 70% of Americans live in cities. So that becomes the place where these inequality issues can be both most pronounced, but in my view, also be really the place where we can actually do something about it. Because I actually think out of cities and density becomes the ability to create the infrastructure of opportunity that is not so easily replicable, particularly in more rural and suburban areas.
Because of the diverse nature of the jobs?
Because it's about diversity, and it's about what comes out of that diversity of people, places, and industries. Because if you can support the diversity of your people by doing, I mean, let's face it, it's pretty amazing. In less than a year, Mayor de Blasio got funding for, and we have up and running, a universal pre-K program, which no matter what your politics are, everybody agrees that early childhood education is the best investment any country can make. And we did it here, and we did it in record time. And so those are long-term investments in terms of the quality of our workforce. We are absolutely 100% committed to making sure that not just are we dealing with the affordability issue on the top, but also how can we create a place where wages can go up. I mean, we have extraordinary issues.
Question, so you could talk.
And whether that's with living wage, which is what we're able to control through our own municipal authority with respect to raising the wages for workers and projects that are sponsored by the city, but really then adding to what I think is a clear national movement around really raising minimum wage to something that might approximate something you might be able to live on. I mean, the numbers are appalling.
How many people does the administration's new living wage law affect? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, we've done some numbers because it's prospective, right?
Yeah.
So in return for being a city-sponsored project, whether we're providing direct subsidy or tax incentives or below market rent or assets, we think probably it's about 17,000 people over the next 4 or 5 years that will impact. So it's
And their families.
And their families,
And their
because at
families.
the end of the day, right, and it's taking people from wages that at minimum wage right now are $8.25 an hour to $13.13 an hour. So you're talking about a 40% increase in your actual wages. And first of all, that's the right thing to do, but also we think it has positive, more benefits to the economy, more broadly speaking. And I think it's leadership of Mayor de Blasio. It's happening, obviously, in LA with Garcetti and Rahm Emanuel. And there's a consortium of mayors through the U.S. Conference of Mayors who are very consciously working on this. And also the president has come out very much in favor of also raising the federal minimum wage. And so this works on multiple levels, politically and economically. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to have two labor markets. That's not fundamentally good policy. We're all in an institutional setting here. But we do have to do what we can do when we have the opportunity to do it and to create that momentum so we can begin to have some wage parity and really raise people's income. So that's been huge. Passing the paid sick law bill is also an incredible sort of
You want to just
inroads.
explain that to somebody, people
Who
in the
don't
audience may not know.
So, I mean,
much
it's amazing.
about
In
it.
Europe, they looked at me like I'm a crazy person. What do you mean that you can work in America and have no paid sick leaves? There's no statutory right. If you're sick, your employer can dock your pay. And so the mayor, with the council, passed the Paid Sick Leave Act, which expands the right for workers to get paid for up to 5 days of sick leave a year for themselves or to take care of a child or a sick relative. And that, again, it actually makes a big difference. I mean, the thought that you could be fired because you have to stay home and take care of your sick kid and or not get paid is just, it's outrageous. And so again, you have to attack these things from multiple angles. How do we create better jobs in the long run? By investing in education. The work we're doing in our Jobs for New Yorkers task force, which is all about spending money training people to develop the skills that people need for the jobs of tomorrow. I often tell people, and they are shocked by this, that the city of New York has been funding, up until quite recently, teaching kids how to fix typewriters. I mean, this is like the level of mismatch between what we are spending money on in terms of workforce development and skills building and where the jobs are.
So you really have to get into the micro
we're
level of these things,
oh my
not
God,
just...
we're in the details. This isn't just like thinking big, deep thoughts. I mean, we have to really unpack what we're teaching our middle schoolers, our high schoolers, and then working very much not only with our public institutions, CUNY and SUNY, which have amazing resources and ultimately should be feeding a huge amount of our workforce, but also our large institutions like Columbia and NYU, and developing partnerships where, again, the curricula actually reflect the needs of the demand side, right? So it's really focusing on the demand side of the equation. I mean, I sit with my tech working group. Oh my God. I sit with these guys in my tech working group once, twice, 3 times a quarter to say, what do you need? Do you need coders? Do you need marketing people? I mean, what do you need and what do you think you're going to need 5 years from now? So that the goal would be over time that we are creating a tech talent pipeline to rival no other, and that it's more equitable and diverse. So it's not just that people are going to recruit at MIT and Stanford, fabulous places, but that they actually say, you know what? At City College and at Brooklyn College, they have one of the most amazing flexible coding programs, and I know I can go hire 20 kids right out of the city system to go work at Kickstarter, to go work at Google.
You know, New York's had a history of having special schools, special high schools, and and they're more diverse than any of us probably know. Is there anything on the boards in terms of accommodating the new demand for technical and coding skills?
Yeah, so I mean, stay tuned. The mayor's making a big speech on Monday, an education speech, but you know, we've really reiterated our commitment to a lot of the work that was started in the Bloomberg administration around what we call CTE schools and STEM schools, science, technology, engineering, and math. Thank you. I'm like living in acronym soup all the time. And really taking that old model, and we're old enough to remember this, of the old vocational high schools, which were amazing. You could go to the aeronautics high school and learn how to fix airplanes and then have a guaranteed job at JFK or LaGuardia. And so for us, those old-fashioned models should be adapted to the technological revolution and innovation economy, and working, again, with the demand side. I mean, if you don't sit with these guys at Google every week, you don't even know what they need, because it's changing so quickly.
And that's the ability of the city to do that stems from its diverse population, stems from the fact that it is at a historical peak in population at this point.
And popularity. I mean, I talked to the guys at Google
they
now.
Go together.
No, but it's cool to be a New Yorker. And so we need to really, I think, leverage that coolness factor and figure out how to pivot it a little bit to also help address some of these fundamental inequality issues. And we're at this amazing moment in time. I mean, I don't know if you guys all watched this, but last week or 2 weeks ago, we launched the first top-level domain in America, .nyc, where if you want to be a small business in New York and be associated with this unbelievable burst of creativity and sort of economic activity, you can now have a top-level domain .nyc. In the first week, 50,000 businesses signed up because people recognize the value of being associated with New York. And this is, we have to capture that. I know, that's what I mean. This is it. It's happening now, and so our challenge is how do we capture some of that excitement and economic prosperity and really think about what it means for the long-term growth of the city and for New Yorkers who have been out of that tent, who haven't been a piece of that story.
You mentioned earlier, and we know that there are a lot of people in the audience who are from different places, that this conference has drawn you here to hear new things. Can you talk a little bit about how the ideas that you and the de Blasio administration are putting forth may be influencing other cities? Who comes to you asking for things, for ideas? I mean, how inundated is your office with calls for, tell us how this works?
It's crazy. I mean, it's crazy in a good way. I came back from London, where I spent a lot of time speaking to the mayor of London about particularly our innovation around the notion of mixing incomes and housing. Again, not generally the way the rest of the world has done it, and understanding that there are models where the private sector can really integrate affordable housing and workforce housing and how important that is. We have been working, we're working on a really interesting exchange program with Barcelona around particularly this idea of it's no longer residential versus manufacturing or residential versus commercial. I mean, there's so much, you know, if you just read, you know, and I've lived in this field forever, the old debates of don't rezone all of our manufacturing districts because then you're going to kill industry, and there's this, you know, really binary approach. And there's so much interesting work going on in the cities, particularly in Europe, in the Netherlands and in Spain and other places, where we're really sharing ideas about how you can do light manufacturing, integrate it, again, with our modern manufacturing agenda, our tech focus, and create housing and new building typologies. So there's huge, people are coming to town all the time to talk to us about that.
So is the transmission of information going both ways?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because
yeah, it's a
I
two-way
think Europe's
street.
ahead of us in a lot of that. Way ahead
I think
of us.
on those issues
On those
around
issues.
mixed use and building typologies, and to some extent funky transportation. I went to go see what London has a gondola system now in one part of East London that they're trying to, again, make another way to get around to where growth is happening. Because again, it's very hard to extend the tube. It's very hard, as you all know, anybody who's a New Yorker, how long has it been since we've been working on the 2nd Avenue subway extension? Like, right? Like, I'm not going to be around long enough.
Well, let's hope you are.
Not that, we love it. It's fantastic. It's going to be great. But, we can't control that. We don't control the MTA budget. We don't have a region. We have a very complex, what I call the jurisdictional mosh pit. So what are the things that New York City can do? And whether that's trams, gondolas, ferries, streetcars, more bikes. And people are really interested in how we're starting to look at those things.
Yeah. You touched on this in your last comment, but you left a fairly nimble entrepreneurial group at Goldman Sachs to join a very large, cumbersome bureaucracy known as the government of the city of New York. How do you drive impact across this vast and often siloed organization?
Well, every organization, even something as nimble as a place like Goldman, has got its own silos and its own, I wouldn't say fiefdoms, but everything isn't always perfect anywhere, right? Bureaucracy can rear its ugly head. That said, I think one of the things that the mayor did, which was incredibly smart, and one of the reasons why I was so excited to take the job, is to group agencies that historically had not been either literally reporting up to one deputy mayor, or the notion that everybody should just go off and do their own thing, and call me when you're done. We have a very, very conscious effort. My job used to be the deputy mayor for economic development. And we very consciously wanted to make it the deputy mayor for housing and economic development, to bring in the 3 or 4 housing agencies that we have in a very conscious way to say, this is not just about housing. This is about economic development. This is about the workforce. This is about placemaking. And so having the planning department.
How many agencies report to you?
I probably have like maybe 18 or 19 agencies and 30 sort of encompassing things like Governor's Island, Hudson River Park, Brooklyn Bridge Park,
Special projects,
landmarks. All of these things are, as you know, better than anybody, absolutely interconnected. And we have a spirit of collaboration and just getting shit done that I don't think permeated the Bloomberg administration in the same way. It's a very collaborative experience.
You meet with them all together on a regular basis,
all
right?
the time. We are, I don't have time for everybody's ego, and everybody's got to come together. We have a very, very expanded agenda. And again, I think, it's very interdisciplinary. And we've always talked about this in terms of teaching students what they need to know to be in this field. You can't just know the math, you can't just know the planning, you can't just know what it is to be a historic preservation person. Because if you're going to rezone Midtown East, you better know all that stuff, right? You better know transportation, you better know landmarks, you better know how to structure a deal with a REIT, and you better understand sort of what is going on with the politics of something that complex.
I'm going to ask one last question, then I think we'll open it up for the audience. And that is, what are the key challenges in the agenda? And I'm sure you could probably talk for about 20 minutes on this one, but it's an open platform for you to
No kvetching. Right. No
kvetching.
I told everybody, no kvetching. I think the challenges are at multiple levels, right? One is we are at an extraordinary moment, I think, right now in New York. For a variety of different reasons, but clearly coming out of the fiscal crisis, the capital markets are very advantageous right now, right? Let's be honest. Interest rates continue to be very low. There's a huge amount of equity, both at the pension funds and in the private equity funds and the hedge funds that are very prone to invest in New York right now. And even equity returns are more reasonable with respect to looking at making large bets. Globally, we're seeing huge amounts of private equity. I'm sure you know the Chinese have made their first investment in Atlantic Yards, a real sort of imprimatur as to how people view New York City, both as a long-term bet, but also in terms of the safeness of the asset class. So we are very much aware that a lot of what we're able to do right now is a function of broader global capital markets issues. So that, if that begins to change, right, which will not necessarily be a result of anything we do or don't do, that could provide a challenge to us because we do rely, obviously, quite heavily on P3 structures to get a lot of this work done. And our revenues, our gross capital product this year was $670 billion. That's a big economy
number.
we're running. And so, obviously, the extent to which the economy stays hot and the interest rate environment stays as it is. We also have, and this is, no surprise, to say that Washington is messed up is an understatement, right? So, if you are an activist, thoughtful, pro-development, wanting to change the world municipal government, and you have to deal with the Congress, I mean, that is a challenge, shall we say.
So you're really saying local government is the place of opportunity.
It's where the action is.
It's where the action is.
I mean, we talk about infrastructure. We need $48 billion in New York City in infrastructure just to maintain a state of good repair. By the way, newsflash, that's supposed to be a federal function. They have basically withdrawn in any systematic way from urban infrastructure, mass transit, and the city of New York simply cannot. I mean, we're smart. We're going to have to get even smarter to figure out how to do that.
We haven't figured out how to print money, only Washington
No,
can
make
do
air,
that.
but we haven't printed money. Hopefully some 3D printer out there will help me figure that out also. So, I mean, these are really systemic challenges. If the federal government is out of the infrastructure business, has slowly but surely been withdrawing support for the housing sector, can't even get their act together to figure out how to deal with student debt issues, which are crippling in many ways. I mean, I talk to employers all the time. If we don't deal with the sort of refinancing of student debt, we're going to have a real problem again being able to get people to come live and work in New York. And so there's just multiple ways in which the problems in Congress do trickle down. And then obviously there's local politics, right? I mean, we won by a landslide. Mayor de Blasio won 73% of the vote. But there's always politics, and there's politics, and it's healthy and it's exciting. But even the smartest ideas on the planet, not everybody might agree with.
Especially in this
Shocking.
city.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's great about it, and the demographics are changing of the city dramatically, and how those stakeholders come to the table, and what happens in Albany. We rely very heavily on legislation from Albany, which allows us to do a lot of what we do. I don't think people understand the state-city connection. The Port Authority is experiencing some challenges.
Troubled waters over there.
Troubled waters. So, no matter how great it all is, you do have to engage with a variety of stakeholders and herd sheep. But that's what we're here to do, right? We came here to put people in a room and get it done.
I think I was told there should be questions from the audience now.
Oh. And right.
Yeah, well, we're coping with the lights.
Delivered live.
Hi, everyone. I'm Seema Valani.
And I'm Amrita Subramanian.
Thank you both so much for the discussion so far. We wanted to present a few questions that we've received concerning this topic. So the first one is, in thinking about economic development generally and looking at affordable housing very specifically, there are numerous public programs that have been created to sort of generate interest and investment in the space. You talked a little bit about some of these, particularly some of the tax incentives that are in place to encourage private capital in the space. So the question is, how can we really encourage more public-private collaboration to support development in this space further? And are there any changes required in the current design to get the right amount and the significant amount of capital to scale up change sort of nationwide?
Wow, okay. A lot of questions in the question. I think the national issue is I'll focus more on what I think we're doing here in New York than some of the challenges nationally. I think that one of the things that has perhaps inhibited as much private investment in affordable housing or mixed income housing in New York has been two things. One has been a little bit of a feeling, again, that the city has not been as pro-growth and pro-density as developers would like to see. So again, by contrast, I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, but think Shanghai last year built 400,000 units of housing or something like that. And the government is 100% pro-growth, and they will do anything and everything to work with the developer to see a deal get done. So one is really changing the atmosphere and then being very open to working with developers to build more and bigger, because they want scale, right? In order to get more private capital, you can't be doing little bespoke deals. So scale is literally and figuratively very important. And so setting a tone around an excitement around density, as long as it's appropriate to the neighborhood and that we've had some discussions, but really setting a shift in tone, which I think most people don't realize is a big deal between what the prior administration was saying and what we're saying. So I think one is about a pro-growth agenda and then having the zoning policies to incentivize that development. And the second thing, which I think really hopefully will help scale this, is that I talked a little bit before about how the programs have been very rigid and narrow in terms of what you have to do to get X. So this famous debate around 80/20s, right? The federal government requires you to do a specific thing. And for a lot of developers and private capital, sites are different, their return horizons are different, their risk tolerance is different, how long they're holding a property is different. And so what I talked about earlier, this flexibility around being able to meet your requirements by serving different populations and not having just a one-size-fits-all. As somebody who used to underwrite and invest in these deals myself, makes a lot of sense. Because again, a deal in Harlem could be very different than a deal in Williamsburg. And so you want to be able to work with private capital and developers to be able to fashion something that gets the city what we need, but allows more people who don't just fit that cookie cutter return profile to get in on the act. So I think those two things, a pro-growth environment and really having more flexibility, will really encourage more people to be in the game.
Great, thank you. So our second question, affordable housing is obviously at the forefront of the administration's priorities, but it has conflicted in the past with other land-based initiatives such as IBZs and industrial policy around manufacturing jobs. So our question is, how do you juggle these competing issues?
Again, I think I alluded to this earlier. I think it's a false dichotomy. I think that we're in a place now where we should be beyond that, them versus us. Look, there are IBZs in the city that are incredibly well utilized and active. There are also IBZs in the city where there's a lot of warehouses, which are not job intensive and are not really creating jobs. So our view is that you need to look at these zones, again, as places where we can construct an infrastructure of opportunity that really allows us to do both. 90% of manufacturing in the city of New York is not noxious, dirty manufacturing, right? And one of the great things about the sustainability movement and clean tech is that what people think of as manufacturing now is no longer like, smokestacks and schmutz coming out of everything, so that you have to isolate it in very specific parts of the city. And so this is the work we're doing, which is we're saying, look at these IBZs. What's really going on here? How can we use this land to make sure that we absolutely retain and grow jobs? But what are these companies actually doing? I was in a company in Sunset Park a few weeks ago. They're making, it's called MakerBot, really cool company. You guys should go out there. And they're making 3D printers, right? This is the manufacturing of today. There's a production line. They're making 3D printers, but there's no schmutz coming out of a smokestack. And right next door, we have the Nets practice facility. We have unbelievable sort of funky retail. And so how do you re-envision what it means to integrate the jobs of today, what I would call the new blue collar, with other uses so that, again, you get much more job intensity. No policy that allows land to lay fallow because they're just warehouses makes sense when you're looking at the sort of demand that we're facing both in the housing and the commercial and retail space. So I think it's old news. I think it's a new chapter for New York City.
Okay. Given that we're now in 2014, we wanted to get a little bit of your perspective on how affordable housing development and sort of maintenance and renovation in this space has really changed post-financial crisis. And what's the role that the public sector has in this space to continue to galvanize change?
Well, again, we're very unique in New York, which is the city of New York always has had a very robust housing production and preservation program. And so even when cycles are down, the city has continued to invest in our affordable housing programs. When times are better, we can put more resources. We just doubled the housing budget so that we can put more money, particularly into preservation, because one of the major challenges with all this good news story that I keep talking about is, rapidly changing neighborhoods where, families and businesses who've been part of those neighborhoods for generations are experiencing displacement. And so it is equally as important to us as we work with folks to build new housing and these new models that we make the existing neighborhoods stable. And so we're putting a lot of resources, and our housing plan lays out, I think it's 40% new construction, new development, and 60% really focused on preserving housing by allowing landlords to get below market rate financing from us. We're rolling out a whole new series of programs to encourage private owners to retrofit their buildings and put in clean energy, which is not only good for the environment, it's also good for the long-term fiscal health of those assets. And really making sure that the families and the people who live in those neighborhoods can stay in those neighborhoods as they rise in value. And I think the city, again, has been the most proactive with respect to that, to saying, we'll refinance your deal. We'll take you down from a 5% commercial mortgage to a 1% mortgage if you agree to limit your rent increases and continue to rent to who we would think of as the right affordable housing folks in that neighborhood. That for us is a really good investment and use of our own money. Again, very unique that the city we're running an enormous housing finance operation at the city. And I think the preservation piece is really important because, as I was saying to Lynne earlier, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Part of what makes New York so cool is the diversity of its neighborhoods. And you have to make these long-term patient capital investments to allow that diversity to continue to exist and to grow. And so we think housing preservation and working with small business owners and local retail to also allow them to stay there is really important just as a smart growth policy.
I think we just have one final question. Okay. You touched on this a little bit, but a lot of the recent discussions in the affordable housing space has been set in sort of a cross-sector collaboration context. We often talk about affordable housing, sort of partnering with public health or education initiatives. You talked a little bit about transportation. So I wanted to get a sense from you on, how important is this sort of cross-sector collaboration, and how can we design the optimal system with the right incentives to get the right players from these respective spaces to kind of contribute their expertise in building a more holistic solution to economic development?
Wow, that sounds so awesome. We could have everybody working collaboratively to serve to deal with health, education, housing. Well, that's the goal. That's the dream. I think, we are again, as I said, in a very thoughtful way, thinking about these things. And people use this lingo a lot, placemaking, place-based development, comprehensive community development. And I'm glad it's gotten into the vernacular, but it does continue to pose real challenges in a practical way. Because, and I always like to say this, if you want to build a fabulous rental project, a mixed income project with a little bit of ground floor retail, and you want to go to Fannie Mae and get that financed, they sort of get that. They're like, okay, I sort of get that. Okay, so let's take it to the next level. I also want to put in an elementary school, and I want to put in a primary care clinic because I really care about having schools and healthcare and retail and housing. They're like, no, sorry, we don't do that. We don't know how to underwrite the income from a healthcare center. And so we have all these ideas. We have all these people coming to the table about how to do this stuff. But often the financial sector has not caught up. And Lynne and I talk about this a lot. People don't have the skills to underwrite across asset classes. They don't know what the risk profiles are. They don't really understand yet how these things all come together. So I guess I would throw it back to you guys, which is you guys have to come. You have to go work in all these places. You have to think much more horizontally and not vertically, and not be scared, right? You have to be able to figure out, of course it makes sense to underwrite a primary care clinic that's backed by a Medicare reimbursement stream. And everybody's like, what is that? That sounds like government. But you know what? It's the best credit you're ever going to get. You know what I'm saying? And so this is what I'm saying. I mean, all these ideas are fantastic, and everybody wants to row in the same direction. But the skill set, right, whether it's the zoning of how you think about how you integrate those, but really the financing of it, that's where sometimes you just go, why can't I get this done? I know this is the right thing to do. And so I would say that really this is what I think is so cool about this gathering is I hope, again, people begin to think in an interdisciplinary way and understand you can't get any of this done without, again, getting out of your silos, get horizontal, think about it as urban real estate, not resi or commercial, right? Become an urbanist. That's the answer to the question.
Great. On that note, we want to thank Professor Sagalyn and Alicia for giving us an incredible conversation this morning.
Thank you.